Since the release of RSC and App Router, I'm seeing a weird anti-pattern that did occasionally show up in Page Router, but now is showing up almost weekly, if not more, in Discords that I see, and questions, and maybe even on Twitter. So I thought, make a video about it, and let's talk about why it's kind of an anti-pattern and why you should just do something else. So here we have a Next.js application from Create Next App, and the only other thing I've done is added this route handler under the APIs. It could be anywhere, but I've just put it in APIs because a lot of people are familiar with that. Inside this route handler, just a hello world. So if we tab over to our page here and then do /API/hello, you get the response, hello world, right? That makes sense. Everybody understands how APIs work, and route handlers are just basically a replacement for the APIs in the page's API routes. So what I'm seeing happen now is something like this. So here is our server component here. It's just the page. So we'll just make this async so we can await. People are doing something like this. Const hello world equals await fetch. And then they have to go outside of their own application to do this. And then we can just do console log, hello world. Okay, so now we have this fetch. If we go back here and refresh, if we go to our terminal, so you can see here, we're making this request every time we refresh the page. So if we refresh the page again, this is our request from hello world. And this is what's being returned. And this is the entire thing because I just returned the fetch and not the actual JSON from the fetch. But you get the idea. So now we've kind of seen it in action. Let's talk about it a bit more. I've drawn the beginning of a diagram and we can start talking about that, and then we'll add to the diagram. So here we have our application, and on our client side, so a client component, you would make the request from your application to the route handler, and the route handler would then return it. So it would be client to the server, and the server would return to the client. That's just how that works. But when you start using server components, immediately you're already on the server. So this part right here, you can handle in the application. So if you want to fetch the details from your database, you can do it right in your server component. Otherwise, what you end up doing is something like this. So here is my request down here, and this is on the server. You're essentially saying this server, which is localhost 3000, right? So that's where I live. It's on localhost 3000. Also, this is also on the server on localhost 3000. So instead of making a direct call from your application on the client to the server, and then the server just returns the data, what we're doing here is saying on this server, so this server, make a call from the server all the way around to the server, and then return the data from the server all the way back around again to the server. So you're essentially saying, instead of just doing this is from the client, goes to the server, server returns to the client. Here, we're going server. I'm going to go in outside of this, go to this location on the server. Then this is going to then send it back to the server into your server. So you're essentially like making extra round trips for no reason. So the argument here is like, okay, well, I want to fetch this data. What do I do now, right? Because you want to be able to access this data. So you have two options, right? So first is the usual way you would do, which is just fetch it from whatever your API is. So let's say this is my planet scale DB, and I make this request, and then I return hello world, right? So that's coming from my database. But people tend to forget that, you know, you can do this in a server component. And then the next part of that is, how do I make it reusable? So how do I make this server component be able to reuse this? Maybe it's some sort of fetch that you have to make to a DB, and you've got to use it in 10 places. So the option number one is you just repeat the fetch over and over again. Even if you've got some helpers or a TypeScript SDK or whatever it might be, you're adding extra complexity because if one piece changes, you've got to change it everywhere. But that's where server actions come in. So server actions are technically in this alpha beta state, but they are going to allow you to repeat and reuse these kinds of like API handlers that you've been doing in the past. And the reason I bring this up is because things like headers, right? So for example, when you use Clerk and you make a request to an API and you're protecting that route, if you're using this method where you're calling localhost you're going to have to attach a session token to this request, even though you already have the session. Because you're going outside of the server, there's no way for us to know that you're coming where you're coming from. So you need to attach it as a cross-origin request almost, because you have no idea where this is coming from. So in the future, all you need to be doing is using server actions. You can use them today. Yes, they are going to probably change a few things here and there. But if you're making these repeatable calls and you're already all in on App Router, using server actions makes the most sense. So my point here is using server actions makes the most sense when you need repeatable server code, or even on the client side, they're going to replace route handlers as the way to interact with your internal APIs. So if you're doing things that you need to internally call, making it a server action makes the most sense, or just make the call right in the server component to whatever database, whatever you need. And of course, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, click right here. There'll be a video about something else, algorithm driven, just click it. And if you're not subscribed, click right here. We're going to make it to 20K by the end of the year.